Welcome everyone to Romantasy versus Reality episode 4 of our series. I am Aaron.
And I'm Grace.
And today we're going to be talking about chapters 19 through 22.
Just your friendly reminder, there are spoilers in this podcast. We talk about everything in depth. It is rated R. We swear. There are sexual references, innuendo, just fun jokes because we're awesome people. We're also going to talk about cocktails, so please be 21 plus if you're going to do any of this.
What are you drinking tonight?
I am having this is a gimlet. It's not a traditional gimlet. It's made with Demerara syrup and Empress gin, which is purple. So I'm really not sure how we managed to get this beautiful earthy fire color, but this is my Calanmai gimlet.
Okay. I am drinking
it's good.
A drink that I call Calanmai, which you can see, which is kind of hard to see there if you see it up here.
No, it's great. You can see the purple.
Purple, otherwise known as Fire Night. It is...
Spoiler alert, it's Rhysand.
It is my take on a Negroni. Some might call it an abomination. Negroni, for those of you who don't know, is a traditional drink originated probably in like 19 teens, 20s in Italy. It is Campari, which is an herbal liqueur, vermouth, which is a fortified type of wine, and gin, which is a takeoff in Americano, which is soda water, vermouth, and Campari, and a cousin to the Boulevardier, which is whiskey, vermouth, and Campari. This one I made with Empress gin. That's how you get the top to it, which looks so dark. And then Campari, but
it's disgusting.
But I couldn't do vermouth because then it wouldn't separate out. So I had to come up with something with a different, I guess you would say, like density that I could float the gin on top of. So I settled for limoncello, which is not at all like vermouth, but you do get some citrus, not as much of the herbal. And I also added a splash of lemon juice just to give it a little bit more a kick. Otherwise, all you get from the limoncello is sweetness.
That's fair. Oh, we missed a golden opportunity. Oh my gosh, I didn't even think about it. I could have had you make my favorite Earl Grey martini the week that we met the Suriel. Literally, tea. The Suriel is known for spilling the tea. I totally missed out. What a loser. Damn. Okay. Well, next time. When we next meet the Suriel, I will make sure to have tea of some sort. Whether it's booze tea or regular tea. I don't know.
Cheers.
Cheers. This is part 1 of the episode where we're going to summarize chapters 19 through 22. During chapter 19, Feyre gets the gallery. Tamlin takes her, he's had the gallery cleaned out, and he has this big reveal. Cue Beauty and the Beast, Belle entering the library for the first time. It's a very big deal. Feyre is moved beyond words, and she is thrilled to see such amazing artwork. She also gets her paints. Tamlin sets her up on the first floor with her paints, and she starts painting. She shifts from this kind of wary uncertainty, kind of dislike, to unable to focus now when Tamlin is gone. It's pretty abrupt, am I right? She actually gets upset about her family and kind of goes on this little vent in the garden and winds up hurting her hand too. So we've got some weird symmetry there. I don't remember Belle ever hurting her hand, but Tamlin kisses her hands and her wounds close. Kind of a weird scene, but I guess it works for them. And then Feyre goes out into the woods and senses Tamlin is following her, so she sets up a snare for him. She snares him and he reads her his dirty limericks. And we learn about his family and his fiddle skills, and then we learn that Calanmai is coming up. And they have a run-in at the end of chapter 19 with the Adder, who becomes a little bit more important later on in the book. We'll talk about it a little later on. This particular fairy makes a lot of references that give us some more insight into what's going to happen later. During chapter 20, Feyre completely disobeys Tamlin's 16 jillion warnings, or it's really like 2 or 3, but he basically says to her, do not, under any circumstances, leave your room during Calanmai. Do not leave your room until the sun is up. There's some fairy fuckery afoot, and I don't want you involved in it. He doesn't explain what the fairy fuckery is, but naturally, even if he had, Feyre would have disobeyed him. So she shows up at Calanmai and meets the most handsome man she's ever seen. We all know that it's Shadow Daddy, but anyway. So, Shadow Daddy... So this mystery man rescues Feyre from 3 creepy fairies with less than kosher intentions, and we find out he's not a Spring Court High Fae because he's not wearing a mask. Lucian, in chapter 21, then spots Feyre, loses his shit, takes her back to the manor because he's freaking out because Tamlin's gonna freak out, and he finally explains what the Great Rite is. Tamlin had multiple opportunities to do so, but didn't, so thank you, Lucian. And Tamlin comes back in the middle of the night before the sun rises. Feyre is out and about, roaming. Still, after all of that, she goes out of her room, and he sees her, and he's like, you look tasty. I'm gonna bite you. So he bites her. Feyre gets weirdly turned on, and that kind of marks our shift from wary to permanently lustful at this point. Now in chapter 22, Feyre wears a dress to dinner, and she takes Tamlin to the gallery to show him her paintings, and Tamlin admits, kind of roundaboutly, that he's caught the feels for Feyre, and Feyre doesn't lock her door when she goes to bed that night. Dun dun dun! And that's our summary of chapters 19 through 22. Tell me about your thoughts for this particular set of chapters.
She starts painting. She gets her bell scene, this time in the gallery, and then gets her paints. And then someone who's only been described as painting small little flowers on furniture and like walls now can paint portraits, caricatures, landscapes, abstract. Like, she's amazing.
We'll debunk it in book 5, but there's a really, really popular theory that Feyre can't paint, and I am totally here for it. There are some amazing memes. Once I figure out how to work the show notes, maybe I can drop some of them in there. There's some really funny reels. You guys would really appreciate those.
I believe it. In my mind, it's just like a bunch of stick figures. It's like when your toddler gives you like their crayon drawings and you put them on the fridge. That's probably what Tamlin's like. Oh, it's beautiful.
That's exactly what it is.
I'll put it on the fridge right next to the other ones.
Yep.
Other than that, she does do she bonds some more with Tamlin. We get Tamlin's backstory.
Yes.
From Tamlin.
We finally get his backstory.
After he told his friend's backstory, he tells her his backstory.
Yeah, that is a little weird.
Yeah.
Just a little.
Then we get the Great Rite, or Colin Mai.
The great fucking.
Yeah.
Let's not be. It's just a massive orgy. I mean, they might not all fuck each other together, but like they all get together and fuck. It's basically Beltane. It's like Sarah J. Maas's version of Beltane. It's a fertility ritual for the ground.
Yeah, and we start getting red flags, which is Tamlin holding stuff back that he doesn't necessarily need to hold stuff back, and it almost comes off as, I don't know, like tension for tension's sake or drama for drama's sake, as opposed to any real reason other than maybe it's just his character and he's just kind of a jerk. And then we get to meet our unnamed, I'm never going to say Shadow. It's just never going to happen. We meet Rhysand.
Okay, so you need to not make the jokes while I'm actively drinking something. I almost spit out my gimlet. Oh my god. Can you say Shadow Daddy?
No. No, I cannot.
Please?
Nope.
Pretty please?
Never gonna happen.
Damn it. I'll break you.
No.
I'll break you eventually. So we do meet our Shadow Daddy. He is amazing. And he's giving off extra spooky vibes. He's like, I'm safe, but am I really?
Oh my
but
God.
Am I really? I love everything about it. I loved everything about their meeting.
It's a touch cliche.
It's fantastic because honestly, she set it up so hard for us to fall for Tamlin that you don't consider any other potential future love triangles. And I personally love how this one was set up. And that is a huge spoiler. If you haven't read book 2, none of what we said will make sense. You'll get a little bit of it in book 2. You'll find out at the end of book 1, going into book 2, how he comes into play. He is hands down my favorite character in the series, closely followed by Nesta. Yes, Nesta. And the Suriel, of course. Of course. But if we're talking mains, it's Rhysand and Nesta. Let's go on to tropes. So let's talk about the different tropes that we've seen and how some of these tropes are changing. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about enemies to lovers.
I think that's more common in the genre of fiction that you read as opposed to...
It sure is.
Yes, as to
and
what I
right.
read, but it is nonetheless a trope.
It is an amazing trope.
It's also a heavy dose of Stockholm syndrome.
It is, yes. That's more like under the forced proximity, though. We'll talk about
Okay.
that a little more. So, with the enemies to lovers, we've seen that shift start. Feyre pretty much hated Tamlin upon sight. Okay,
Right.
not pretty much. Feyre hated Tamlin on sight. She became wary in chapters probably 5 to 12. She was very wary and hateful. And then the last set of chapters we did, 12 to 18, we see her start to shift, not necessarily to friends, but to noticing things. Like Tamlin had just offered his friendship to her in those chapters toward the end, like around chapter 17, 18. So they weren't really friends, but at that point they weren't really enemies. And here we see the definitive shift. Feyre wears the dress. She goes to dinner. Lucien pieces out. He's like, I have somewhere else to be, anywhere but here, because clearly you came ready for some fuckery. He deuces out for dinner, and they go and they have their little moment in the gallery. And that's our, I think, turning point.
Yeah, I would agree. She has been kind of back and forth, especially in the chapters that we read before, but now she's just fully Team Tamlin, I guess.
Oh, yeah. And she commits to it, and she commits to it hard.
She does for a little while.
For quite a while. But we'll talk about that down the road. Since you brought up Stockholm Syndrome, we'll skip over to forced proximity.
Okay.
Talk about your Stockholm Syndrome.
He kidnaps her. He literally
we know that.
He literally
Yeah.
takes her and not forces her to live there, but
forces her to live there, because if she doesn't live there, she can't really safely live anywhere else.
No, because every time she leaves by herself, she almost dies.
Yeah, we'll talk about that and the lack of character development she has in these chapters. I agree, they really hit it hard with the Stockholm Syndrome shift. She goes from, I hate my captor, to, well, I'm around him all the time, and now I'm starting to see these amazing things about him. But he's really, other than Lucien, the only person I'm around. And I don't really get a lot of information or backstory from Lucien. And when he is around, he's kind of pimping Tamlin pretty hard. Mm-hmm. So my obvious choice is Tamlin. And so that's who I'm kind of edging toward. Speaking of Lucien and the information we don't get on him, what's up with the tragic backstory for quite literally every character we meet? Every single one. Not a one of them is unscathed.
Not even the maid.
No.
It's
and
everyone.
We don't get it, but she like hardcore hints at the fact that she's got some ish in her history.
It's like an edgelord D&D group. It's like everyone
again with the jokes while I'm drinking.
Everyone has a tragic backstory.
They do.
It's and just so once bad. I want one of the characters when they'd be like, what happened? I'm like, well, my parents loved each other.
Yeah.
They were very supportive. I had lots of friends growing up. I fit in well. And yeah, here I am. It was pretty good all around.
You're going to love my book. I actually have one of those.
Yeah.
Yes.
It is almost
it's unheard
startling
of.
change now to not have
it's its own trope.
A screw. Yeah. It's a subversion at this point to have a normal upbringing.
Yes, it's the new punk.
Parents that love each other and support you.
I know, it's so terrible. I mean, Lucien, I think of all of them, at least from what we know so far, I feel like Lucien's backstory is the worst. And they murder his lover in front of him, and then they chase him out of the court and try to hunt him down and murder him too. It's almost like a game of cat and mouse.
Yeah, like I said, it's all tragic. Everyone's tragic.
Yeah, so we get Tamlin's extra special tragic backstory now too.
Yes.
So now we know Feyre's, now we know Tamlin's, now we know Lucien's, and of course Alice, who's the only other character with any substance. So really we only have like 4 characters with substantial information about them, and Alice has the least amount, and we still know that her backstory is not pleasant.
Yeah, it almost makes you wonder. I don't know if Sarah J. Maas has siblings, but I imagine with the way she writes her characters that they are terrible people. And I'm sorry if you're a sibling of Sarah J. Maas. She obviously doesn't think highly of you because everyone's siblings are terrible people in this story.
So, I mean, and it's kind of a perk of being an author. You never know who these people are. They could be people who fucked with her in high school, or people who put her writing down on like fiction press or whatever, or maybe like a former ex or whatever that she just wanted.
But everyone's siblings, everyone, Tamlin, Lucien, Feyre, all messed up.
I'm just saying.
All I'm saying is
there are some people who have non-messed up siblings that we meet later. if that helps. I think
I'm
there's like one character who has a sibling that's not messed up.
just saying
They're dead though.
it reeks of it. It just kind of reeks of middle child syndrome. I wonder if she was like a middle child.
I have no idea. We should Google it later. The other tropes that I wanted to talk about were poor communication, which we'll get to in a minute, and he falls first, which is honestly something we kind of usually see with more contemporary romances or sports romances. But in this case, we're really seeing it. And I don't know if it's because, yes, sports romance is a specific subgenre of romance. Don't ask.
I don't want to know.
Hockey is really one of the most popular ones, but I think baseball's up there too. I don't know. I've read a few of the hockey ones. They're not bad. Don't judge me.
Sure, why not?
Honestly, I don't know if we see that from Tamlin because he knows that he kind of has to. Technically, he does not have to fall for Feyre. We're not going to find this out, so I won't go into depth about it. But the way that that specific curse is worded is that she's got to fall for him. So we're seeing signs of him falling for her. We're getting the genuine smiles, the opening up finally. And I think really it's him falling for her, or at least giving her the illusion that he is, that causes her to fall.
He could be playing the long game.
He could be. I know you did.
But at the same time, you would expect him to be able to do that as someone who's been around for hundreds of years. But
yeah, nothing but patience and persistence.
But then sometimes they just don't act like they've been around for hundreds of years.
Well, it's really hard to write a character that's been around for hundreds of years if you've only been around for like 30.
It's true. Also, we should probably talk about the other thing. It's not a trope, but I'll probably forget about this. We don't mention it now. We find out iron is not a weakness of the fairies.
Correct.
Ash is definitely a weakness. And then we learn their other weakness, which is a snare. So what the mural didn't show was just a field of snares and fairies hanging from various trees upside down.
Oh, please. Tamlin got out of that snare so fast. We all know that he did that on purpose. He was trying to build her confidence. Like, he literally, in a move that, of course, an athlete could probably pull off, but I sure as fuck can't with my diastasis, he just, like, sits up. Like, his whole ass body just sits up, and he just cuts the little thing with his talon and just lands on his feet. Meanwhile, Feyre's like, no, you're gonna fall. And oh, wait. Yeah, how could I possibly forget what you are? Of course.
It's still.
They are terrible at
Serial, High Lord, it doesn't matter.
It's true.
They all fall for the snare.
They do.
Except for Alice.
Poor Alice.
Their greatest general.
I know. Honestly, Alice really kind of saves the day in this book. If it wasn't for Alice, Feyre would probably just wander around Prythian. She wouldn't have any idea where to go or how to find Tamlin later, but we'll talk about that in the next coming chapters. Poor communication.
Oh, yes. The greatest trope
the worst.
Of all.
Tell me what the worst trope is and tell me why it's poor communication.
It's a way to build tension without actually having a good reason to build tension. So anyone at any time could have told Feyre what the Great Right was, why she should stay inside.
They sure as fuck could have, yes.
Yeah. And one would think that she would have asked exactly what it is. If not Tamlin and Lucian.
She did, and he just said, it's fairy. It's fairy as fuck. I believe his exact words were, it's very fairy. Can I go? No, Feyre, you cannot go.
But you think she would have asked Lucian, Alice, any of the other servants that remain nameless?
She wasn't really spending time with any of them at that point.
She talks about hanging out with them in the kitchen while they were preparing meals for it.
That's true.
Checkmate.
I would say check, not checkmate.
She just doesn't. No one tells her, and maybe she does ask, but we don't know that.
In this case, I really feel like the poor communication trope was used here as a plot device. Without that lack of communication and understanding what is happening in the Great Right, she might not have gone to go look at it. But I look at it this way. If Tamlin had said, I have to go fuck someone to replenish my quartz magic, that might have been a good opportunity to show that Feyre couldn't really control her jealousy and wanted to go check out maybe who he might wind up fucking. So She could have done that without the poor communication trope,
Yeah.
in my opinion, and I think it would have been better for it.
I mean, we all know that Fairy doesn't listen to warnings.
No,
She has yet to heed a warning.
Feyre doesn't listen.
What did I say?
Fairy?
Fairy? I thought I said Feyre. Fairy does not heed warnings. She just...
Not at all. No.
She wanders out in the streets without looking both ways.
Pretty much if you give her a warning, she takes it as an invitation.
She puts metal
She's like,
objects
challenge
in
accepted.
sockets.
Hold my fairy wine. Let me get on this.
Yeah, she's basically just like a bumbling toddler around.
She's like Tommy Pickles from Rugrats. Oh, I'm not allowed to do this? Watch me MacGyver my way out of this shit.
Or like a Mr. Bean.
Or Mr. Bean. So since we're talking about Feyre's complete lack of ability to learn her lesson, let's move on to part 5, character development, and talk about how Feyre never fucking listens. So let's start. What's the first time we see like her? The first warning is not to go too far in the woods, right? Which at least breaking that rule, I understand because there's no game anywhere else. So she's got to go further into the woods.
Right.
So that one makes sense. What's the second one?
To not trust your senses.
To not trust your senses, right?
Right.
And what does she do?
First time she sees something that doesn't make sense, she just believes it wholeheartedly.
Yep. She just deludes herself into thinking, yep, my dad totally came for me.
Full-throated endorsement.
The next one.
Well, she gets that one multiple times. She gets it again.
Yeah. And then not to go too far out into the woods on her own, right? Even though Lucian says he would come if she called, like, she's been warned not to go into those woods alone.
Yeah.
So what happens when she does? The Naga. 4 extremely hungry, human-eating fae. Then, of course, we have don't go to Calanmai.
Right. Then don't leave your room again.
Yes. Then the second time, he brought her back. Lucian brought her back from Calanmai and said, do not leave your room. Tamlin will go crazy when he can smell you but can't find you. It's a bad idea all around. Wait till dawn. It's the third time she was told.
She's like, fuck that noise.
She's like, except I forgot to go to my room without eating dinner. Oh no. Must go to Calanmai. Oh, Lucian brought me back. This is ridiculous. I'm hungry. I can't sleep. Let me go to the kitchen.
Oh, is she diabetic? Like, why does she have to eat every 10 minutes now?
I don't know. Maybe all those years without food and on the brink of starvation fucked up her body. I don't know.
I think after Lucian explained to her why she can't leave,
she should have taken the hint.
Yeah.
It wasn't even a hint. It was concrete instructions not to go somewhere. Since we're on Feyre, we'll also talk about her extreme 180 from hating Tamlin to wanting some of that fey cock, because really that's kind of what happened. She went from I hate you to maybe you're not so bad to oh my god, I want to fuck you. Like, you are so attractive to me and I'm not really sure why, and this is wrong maybe, but god, I want to fuck you. And maybe she's just really hard up because it's been a while since she's seen Isaac. Who knows? But like, that was pretty rapid. Just for me.
Yeah, well, it's like the daddy issues thing, right?
Daddy issues.
Really. Daddy issues. Grew up in a poor home. Guy shows her a little kindness and she's just all about it.
I really think that is one of her biggest issues, is she has zero sense of self-worth. She grew up with daddy issues, I guess, if that's what you want to call it. But then she grew up with Nesta and her mother basically putting her down for everything. Nesta calls her a half-wild beast at one point, which, of course, she uses to relate to Tamlin. And then she's got no self-confidence going into Prithian. And then he flatters her a little bit and she's like, oh my god, curse sploosh.
Yes. Lights a fire in her loins, if you will.
Yes. Turns her core molten.
Yes. And her bowels watery.
I don't think that was a response to Tamlin.
No.
That was the fear response.
Yeah.
Sorry. Although I can see how easily you can confuse the two. I understand.
She just seems to have a lot of like abdominal issues.
She does. She really does. So we're talking about her shift. We're going to have to talk about Tamlin's too, because Tamlin, and he shifts from awkward to trying to just genuine.
Right.
Which that shift makes sense. But then like he shifts like from, we'll just say like blue to green, blue to green. Like he's just kind of like neutral over here, kind of awkward to green. And then he kind of goes to yellow a little bit here. And then he just goes into red. So like he goes from uh, uh, indifferent to I like you and I'm starting to become charming to a little red flaggy, like I'm gonna bite you because I can't control my magic, and then like do not disobey me. I'm sorry,
Yes.
what? Like
Little bit of red flag.
little bit? Oh my gosh, I have some quotes here and oh, it drove me nuts. So let's get out Grace's notebook of color coded quotes. I don't know if you can see the color coding. There's color coding. Where does he start? Our first glimpse on page 173 is where he's kind of obsessed with her safety. Don't worry, Feyre. Soon you'll find out everything when it's safe. And that's when you're talking about like he's holding back
Yeah.
information that he might not need to. He could tell her something's up. He might not be able to tell her there's a curse. He was able to get enough out to tell her there was a blight. We know the blight is human or not human. We know the blight is
A
a
person.
who, not
Yeah.
a what. So he could tell her there's someone fucking with their magic and it's a little bit more than just a blight. He could get around it in other ways, but he just straight up refuses to talk about it and instead relies upon her eavesdropping. That's red flag number 1. And then we have red flag number 2 on page 197. Don't ever disobey me again. And I'm sorry, but that's giving me the ick. It's giving me super red flag, major red flag, controlling, abusive, kind of you're crossing that line into somebody that I don't think that I would want to be with, because in real life that flag would be like I'm about to start hitting you.
It's a little bit slower. In chapter 23, he goes through her phone and starts texting all of her exes.
Yeah.
Then by chapter 30, he's like, "Why'd you make me do this?"
Yeah, the blaming her. Yeah, that actually does happen. Uh, ugh, no, we're not going to get into that. That's book 2. We're not going to.
But it's a
But
fine line between, not a fine line, but there is a line between protective and overbearing.
there is,
And
yeah,
Tamlin eventually crosses
crosses
that
that
line.
line. Yeah. Honestly, while we're talking about kind of that strange behavior, that crossing of that line, Feyre had crossed not into the overprotective line, but she had crossed into making peace with the fact that her family was okay and that her oath was fulfilled. And then, something I don't know if it was just because things were going too right at Prithian and she just didn't the idea that possibly developing feelings for Tamlin didn't set well, but she got really wigged out. She got really spooked all of a sudden. And so like right at the beginning of chapter 19, well not the very like in the middle of chapter 19 on page 170 to 171, she starts talking about being erased. She said, I'd been erased from their lives, forgotten. I let him erase me, which is, kind of an abusive mentality. Like that's how people in abused relationships kind of start out. They kind of let themselves be erased. She's I let him erase me. He'd offered me paints and the space and time to practice. Maybe that's how she gets good at painting. He'd shown me pools of starlight. He'd saved my life like some kind of feral knight in a legend. Not a knight in shining armor, a feral knight in a legend. Do you know any feral knights in legends? Because the only 2 knights I can think of are like the ones of the Round Table and then A Knight's Tale with Heath Ledger, which was amazing. Okay.
I
Anyway,
can't get over the soundtrack in that movie.
that soundtrack is amazing.
It just
I
doesn't
need
fit.
I need more really horribly done, historically completely inaccurate movies with terribly new soundtracks and kitschy dialogue. That whole movie is a vibe and it made me so happy.
I will give you, it is very unique.
I absolutely loved it. I love it. Alan Tudyk is in it. Heath Ledger is in it. Paul Bettany is in it. There's jousting, and you know what? This isn't ACOTAR related. I love A Knight's Tale. Anyway, so some kind of feral knight in a legend. And then she says, and I gulped it down like fairy wine. And in my notes, I literally wrote, at least you realize how dumb you are. Kudos. Because really, she did. Like I said in our previous episode, she would eventually have been won over just by safety and kindness alone.
Yeah.
And that, in her mind, is kind of what happened, right? In her mind, She was like, I let him buy me some fancy ass shit and be nice to me and show me some fancy things. And all of a sudden I've forgotten my family and he erased me. I let him do it. Thank you. Thank you for at least realizing that, because that's exactly what happened to you, right? You kind of just let yourself forget about them. I'm here for it. Personally, they treated you like abso-fucking-lute crap. But there's something to be said for doing the introspection to recognize that you're also letting yourself forget about them.
Yeah, but then she gets over it like the next page.
Yeah, she gets over
It's
it
like
literally
super
that
fast.
same page. That same page. She is upset. She grabs the thorny rose in the garden and she's just mad. And something kind of breaks within her. And she said, they didn't try to stop you from taking me. Girl, bye. At that point, that's when you just say, fuck all of them. They're written out of the will. I don't want them in my life. I'm gone. Sorry. It's like, bye, Felicia. Sayonara. You don't have to revisit this again. This is now dead.
Yeah.
It should have been dead when she realized last time, but I do like the introspection of realizing that they were fading from her life.
I do like the introspection, but at the same time, she probably should have like dwelled on that, not just move straight on to like the okay, well, goodbye, family, and I'm over it. I've completely forgotten the fact of how quickly this guy was able to win me over with a little bit of kindness. Maybe there's something to that, and I should explore that.
I'm going to devil's advocate it because it was my original point, so I obviously agree with you. But I'm going to go ahead and remind you that she's 19 and she has no example whatsoever of what a loving relationship looks like.
Well, it's true, but she has the introspection to realize that he bought her off, as
And
fleeting as it might be.
yes, and then her hormones kick in and she realizes she wants to fuck him. So all of that's overridden.
Yeah, but she's acting like a 13-year-old boy. Like she's just got her first boner. And she's like, oh God, what is this? This is amazing.
I'm just saying.
Because
I have to point it out, right? I agree with you. I think it's ridiculous that literally from one breath to the next, I think it's leading up to a realization and it wasn't necessarily written well. Like that realization should have been, there, and then maybe that moment should have been a little bit later, like the next day in the woods. She could have stewed on it for a little while and not just 3 hours.
Or they could have linked it to one of his red flag comments. Like that's what kicks off her introspection. Like when all of a sudden she sees glimpses of his more controlling or overbearing side, and she's like, wait a minute, maybe this is not what I thought it was. Maybe I let this person buy me off because I was in such a bad place. Maybe I was just so happy to get away from my family and be released from my childhood.
8-year-old call to action. Yeah. I will say, because there's a lot of inconsistency in the first book, but, because a lot of people kind of forget about this leading up to the second book where it becomes more important. Feyre has never really sat back and taken it when Tamlin tells her to do something. She's always questioned, argued, fought back, and stuck up for herself, even if it's only verbally. She literally says, I don't have to do what you tell me.
Right.
And it's in here. It's actually, I have the page number. When he says that to her on page 197, he says, don't ever disobey me again. And, well, she actually said his voice was a deep purr that ricocheted through her, awakening everything and lulling it into complicity. So at first, she's just kind of like, ooh, because she's probably got a little bit of a control kink. Well, it's not, we don't judge here. But then she says, then I reconsidered his words and straightened. He grinned at me in that wild way, and my hand connected with his face, which I kind of like. I mean, not necessarily the slapping, but he responds well to it, right? Like he's a physical being. His anger manifests physically. Everything about him manifests physically. So I think he understands physical behavior more than words.
Right. No, that's a completely healthy relationship.
Oh, I didn't say it was healthy. I'm just saying like what she does makes sense for their relationship and his character. And then she flat out says, don't tell me what to do. And don't bite me like some enraged beast. I mean, she does. She fights back. And I was wrong. She also does, in fact, fight back physically, not just verbally. And I think that that's important to note because it kind of gets lost in the upcoming chapters, where she is, in my mind, she is a very big badass in the upcoming chapters. Like she goes through hell. Honestly, she does it for him, and he's already started treating her like that. So I think that those things are important to note.
Yeah.
No, we can move on to part 6. Part 6 is plot and world building, and we've talked about Cal and Maya a little bit, but I'm going to talk about it more from a world building perspective. Beltane is the common Americanized pronunciation. If I pronounce it in the actual Gaelic pronunciation, nobody will know what the fuck I'm talking about, but it's a fire festival. She talks about the big bonfires that are being lit up. We already know that Sarah J. Maas pulls a lot of her lore from different mythos, and Celtic mythology is one that she pulls. She lifts names straight from it, and that's fine. Everyone does it. I mean, I've done it for my books, so, I get it. But I do like how she incorporated it and made it kind of a fairy tradition, because it's a very pagan tradition. It's a very pagan festival. I mean, I'm not as familiar with the Christian relation to the fire festival. I'm not sure if there's a direct correlation. I think there is, but it's escaping me right now. I didn't really sleep last night. I stayed up reading Variation. Thank you, Rebecca Yaros, if you end up listening to these. It's a really nice kind of nod to that particular festival, because it's a fertility festival in pagan mythology. It is where the goddess mates with the god, for lack of a better word, and she is at her most fertile, and that's the conception point, essentially, for the god in the Celtic Wheel of the Year. And she translates that into her fairy lore for this world. And I thought that that was really good. And she even incorporates the Great Rite, which is kind of drawn from that idea of, the god being reborn. In this case, instead of the god being reborn, it's the land.
Right.
That's how they keep the spring as spring. She does mention here, it's on page 193, Lucian, actually. She has Lucian say that all courts go through the Great Rite. We'll talk about that later. But I liked Calanmai as world building. I thought it gave some nice depth and, maybe not spirituality or religion, but tradition.
Right. It's tradition.
It gave really good cultural and traditional background to that world.
Because at this point, they've briefly referenced gods.
Yes. And
but only
that the humans lost them.
Yeah, only insofar as to say that they've forgotten the names of them, not in any current tradition. So
right. And the humans don't celebrate holidays at all. So she doesn't even know what Calanmai is.
Well, they may just not.
No, she doesn't. She's like, what is that? We don't celebrate holidays in the human mainlands.
I just thought she said they don't have that one.
Nope. That one is going to be a little harder for me to find because I didn't make a direct...
That's not super important.
It's not super important, but I'll look it up while you make your point.
That was my point. So it's a nice bit of tradition, a yearly festival, one of, I would assume, many festivals that they have, or at least used to have before the Blight, but yes. Some still continue.
Here we go. On page 178, she says, "We don't celebrate holidays in the human realm, not after your people left. In some places, it's forbidden. We don't even remember the names of your gods. What does Fire Night celebrate?" I don't think she even feels like she can pronounce Calanmai, maybe? I mean, he literally just said Calanmai, but, she couldn't repeat it, so... And then he just kind of says, it's just a spring ceremony. We light bonfires, and the magic that we create helps regenerate the land for the year ahead. And she says, how do you create the magic? He said, there's a ritual, but it's very fairy.
Does that mean all their rituals are sex?
I don't know.
Christmas, sex, New Year's, sex?
No, Ninsar is one of the holidays that we'll hear about later, and the solstices are there, and those aren't...
Hanukkah, sex.
Those aren't related to sex.
Kwanzaa.
I think it's interesting that they don't have holidays or the gods, and she starts to say you people, and then she says your people.
Like, what do you mean by you people?
Right? She indicates that it's the fault of the fairies that they no longer worship the gods and goddesses. And I don't think that ever really gets touched on again, but that's kind of interesting. The humans, maybe she's implying that the humans lost faith in them because the fairies just kind of stomped them in the war. I mean, they did get the treaty, but only because other Fae fought for them, not because of the merit of the humans.
Or maybe it was just more that the fairies were more, they were the ones who celebrated and had the traditions. And so
and forced the humans to do it.
either forced or not necessarily forced, but just kind of pushed it forward so that when they left, they just associated it all with the fairies. And so it went the way of the dodo.
Yeah. And they do mention, that a lot of the humans in Fairy were slaves. Even Tamlin mentions that his family had slaves. So it's very distinctive that maybe when the humans got free, they were like, fuck you and your traditions, we're done.
Right.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's a good point. But I do think that Mai, all of the holidays that they add in, she adds in later, honestly, add a really nice layer of complexity to the world building.
Makes it more lived in.
Yes. You wanted to talk about the adder.
Right. So she does a little bit of eavesdropping. The adder shows up.
Well, I don't think she intentionally eavesdrops on that one.
No, she didn't. She was too scared to move. It says it in there.
Yeah, well, he told her not to move. If she moved, she would have been seen.
And she didn't have a snare with her, so she would have been really in trouble.
Yes, very much so.
So she gets a little bit more reference to her.
Yes.
And her is not... I think it further not humanizes, fairyizes her, because before it was like this nebulous being, High Lordess, High Lady.
Yeah, she even says that. She says maybe instead of a High Lord, a High Lady.
But it's obviously someone who is in some sort of position of power, a very tangible...
Well, we know that there are no High Ladies.
I'm not going to make a comment.
Anyone who's read the book is laughing right now at the thought of her being a High Lady. Is just, that bitch.
So we as the reader can start putting it together, right? That this is someone of power, possibly someone who heads a court, but we don't know for sure. Referred to as the deceiver, someone who's associated with the king.
Yes.
One of his higher echelon generals. So just small little pieces start clicking into place.
This is also the second time that we've heard that Tamlin has a heart of stone.
True.
Lucian is the first one to say it. He says, for someone with a heart of stone, it's certainly soft these days. And that was somewhere in the last chapters from like 5 to 18. I don't remember where it fell at this point. But then the adder mentions too, for someone with a heart of stone, you seem to care an awful lot or something along those lines.
Yeah, that's about what it says.
Yeah. We get another reference to her with the adder, and I'll talk about it in my things to note for future references too, but we get another reference to our future villain here in chapter 19. I'll talk about it. It's on page 169 and I'll talk about it later. Okay. We talked a little bit about this, but we had Feyre's really weird, like very fleeting moment of doubt where it's the first time she realizes that she likes spending time with Tamlin. And I think that's what spooks her, and she gets irrationally mad at him and says he made her family forget her. But I will say, we've already talked about that, so I don't need to beat it to death again. But it does bring us this quote from Tamlin. And honestly, it's probably the best Tamlin quote in the entire series. He says to Feyre, it's on page 172, if anyone wants to look it up, "Don't feel bad for one moment about doing what brings you joy." And honestly, that's probably the best thing Tamlin says, period, in the entirety of the series, in my opinion. I mean, maybe he says something later, but...
Don't think about it too much, though. Like, you want to do some drugs, maybe go skydiving without a parachute. Hey, if it brings you joy, don't feel bad about it.
Okay, so that's not what I'm getting at. But I'm noting this quote here because it's specifically said on page 172 by Tamlin, and we hear it later. That quote is repeated later. I have to double check, but I'm nearly 100% positive that quote is repeated later by another character. Since I've got a few quotes in there, of course. There you are. I've been looking for you. Because who doesn't love that moment? That quote seems completely and totally innocuous. And when I told you it was my favorite quote, you just kind of were like, okay, fucking weirdo. But that quote, there is such an amazing payoff for that quote in the next book. It is absolutely phenomenal for me. And then another quote for world building. I'm bringing this up specifically for world building. Rhysand says to Feyre, we don't know he's Rhysand, but our mystery man with violet eyes and all black hair, who is very tall and the most handsome man Feyre has ever seen in her entire existence.
Yes.
On page 191 says, she says, if you're not from the Spring Court, then how are you here? And he says, quote, because all the monsters have been let out of their cages tonight, no matter what court they belong to. So I may roam wherever I wish until the dawn. He's implying that he's one of those monsters. But I want you to kind of take a moment to remember this quote, because in the next few chapters, by the time we get to the end of the book, that quote hits a little bit differently. And then we get, again, more payoff for that quote, not directly. If you remember this quote, it makes sense when he's explaining later in book 2, but there's kind of a payoff for what he means behind this quote at that point in time. I really liked that. Our last point of plot that I wanted to talk about was that Feyre finally, at the end of chapter 22, pleads with Tamlin to let her help him. Is there anything that I can do to help you with the blight?
And as will be repeated numerous times, he just kind of shuts her down.
Yeah, he just blows her off. He's like, no, you can't do anything.
Sit there and look pretty.
I got this. So let's move on to part 7. And part 7 is Aaron's thoughts on our book boyfriend. So what do you think about Tamlin as a book boyfriend?
So as a book boyfriend, I can appreciate the thought to be protective, especially someone who seemingly puts themselves in harm's way due to their own
stupidity.
Okay, we'll say stupidity. Numerous times.
Naivete.
Yeah, naivety. That was better.
Is
but
it really? Because she's directly warned multiple times and does what she's told to do. It's stupidity.
But then he starts going a little overbearing, and the one thing that it's hard to read and hard to deal with when she's pleading to help and he's just like, no, I got this. He's very stoic and very overbearing, and he crosses that line. And like I said earlier, he's the kind of guy that's going to go through her phone and fake text all of her friends to make sure that she's not cheating on him, and eventually cut off. Well, he already cut off relationship with her.
Yeah, he already isolated her.
Yeah, so he already did that, and then he's going to get angry one day, and
and he does.
She's going to catch 5 across the face.
Yeah, pretty close. Yeah.
So he's starting to show some of those red flags. What started off as good intention is starting to dwell into the darker side.
Yeah, Tamlin's got some anger issues.
And really what the relationship boils down to is just him hoping that she will serve a purpose. Her with Stockholm Syndrome mixed with some baseline daddy issues.
Their relationship is just a giant red flag.
Yeah, it pretty much is.
It's toxic.
It's just kind of an interesting way, especially with the juxtaposition of it being set almost like Beauty and the Beast. That you put this, even though some would say that is a toxic relationship with Stockholm Syndrome, but it's something that people still associate with like this wholesome story from their childhood.
Well, I mean, all of our Disney movies are, right? I mean, look at my favorite Disney movie. Yeah. I was obsessed, still am, with The Little Mermaid. She literally gives up everything that she is, changes her entire self to be with a boy at 16.
Yeah, wow.
And insists her daddy lets her do it.
Yes.
But daddy, I love him.
It's best
Actually, it's more like, but daddy, I love him. I mean, that's kind of the vibe Feyre's giving off. She's definitely Belle. Let's not cross over too much, right? But her dad doesn't invent stuff. He's a merchant, but it's the same vibe.
Yeah.
It's toxic.
It is toxic. Like I said, it's a nice juxtaposition of those, what would be like a sweet kind of innocent story from our childhood and this adult toxic relationship kind of mixed together. And I think that's what makes it interesting from a reading perspective. Take something familiar and kind of change it enough that it makes you think.
So I'm going to devil's advocate you. Is she really changing it? Or is she taking away the rose tint on our glasses for the original story? Because as children, we see this beautiful fairy tale, right? And it's nostalgia And we love that they're in love. We really appreciate their love story as children because that's the message we're supposed to get as children. But as an adult looking back on that relationship, there's like a jillion red
I
flags.
would say 100% that she does change it. The difference between the
I'm not just talking about like Feyre can't read.
no. The difference between Tamlin and the Beast, Tamlin is way more overbearing and kind of keeps Feyre locked away, whereas the Beast was actually willing to sacrifice and not break his curse to let Belle go. At no point does Tamlin say, realistically, he doesn't take her back to her family or put her back like permanently to her family.
Okay. Obviously, somebody doesn't remember all of book 1, so we'll tackle that in the next few chapters.
Well, they get the visit.
Oh no. No.
What?
No. We'll tackle it in the next few chapters. He straight up sends her home and goes back to under the mountain, knowing that.
Oh yeah, that's right, because that's how she came. Yeah, you're right. Sorry.
Yeah.
I would still say he's way more overbearing. I
Oh,
stand
he's
by
a
my.
complete douche compared to the Beast is genuinely just the Beast does not have the controlling traits. He is unwilling to try with Belle because he just has kind of given up. Whereas Tamlin is willing to try. He hasn't quite given up, but then when he falls for her, he kind of shows his true colors. The Beast doesn't necessarily have those true colors. Like when
Right.
the Beast falls for Belle, that's it. Everything becomes about Belle. When Tamlin falls for Feyre, it becomes about how he can shelter Feyre.
Yes, he never
Feyre
really
becomes the
tries.
rose in the vase.
He just keeps her locked away
Yeah.
as opposed to just letting her go. Not to mention, the Beast is way cooler. I mean, that's just baseline.
That was one of your favorites growing
And
up, right?
and Lumiere. As much as I like Lucian, Lumiere is so much cooler than Lucian. Like,
Oh.
I mean, he's the man.
No, I love Lucian. Well, I do. I love Lucian. But I loved Lumiere. Lumiere and the little feather duster.
Mm-hmm.
My French accent is terrible.
It
oh my
is pretty
god,
bad.
yeah, it's really bad. I don't mean that in like an offensive way. I'm terrible at a French accent.
But yeah, that's my view on it. As far as book boyfriends go,
Yeah, he's kind of not the
what
greatest.
started off nice is showing signs of not so nice.
It's like when you bite into an apple and it's like rotten inside.
I wouldn't say it's rotten yet,
It's
but
like turning brown.
There's a couple dark soft spots in there.
Yeah. But I think too. Oh god. I'll play some devil's advocate again, right? Much like Feyre, Tamlin, when he's talking about his parents, he says that if his mother, it's on page 176. So he's talking about his mom's mating bond, and to his dad, he finds out that they're mated, and he's not being groomed to take his father's place. And Feyre asks about his mother, and he said, "My mother loved my father deeply, too deeply, but they were mated, and even if she saw what a tyrant he was, she wouldn't say an ill word against him." So she's kind of an enabler, and that's what Tamlin saw. That's what he wanted out of a relationship. Like that's the only real relationship he had before his entire family was killed. So, he doesn't have a great example for relationships either. Clearly, he's got no game despite being alive for his Riz is down here. It should be up here for someone who's been alive for as long as he is. He's giving off like small dick energy. But he is.
Okay.
Just saying. Anyway, he's not my favorite book boyfriend, but then again, he's not my favorite character at all. So I'm going to move on to our last part of the segment, which is part 8, notes to pay attention to for the future. Maybe eventually you'll have some of these, but actually, no, you won't because you haven't read past this book. So these are all kind of for you to remember and for any of our listeners who are reading along or who maybe are doing a read through that didn't catch these. On page 169, it's going to give us our second mention of Feyre dreaming about death, specifically death, and, quote, "that horrible pale woman ripping me to shreds, all watched over by a shadow I couldn't quite glimpse." I'm going to point out that it's really interesting who we meet right after she's having this dream, because this is at the beginning of chapter 19. And then in chapter 20, we meet Shadow Daddy. And then we also have the second mention of stay with the High Lord, you will be safe. Once again, who do we meet right after this? I mean, I know that in this particular instance, stay with the High Lord, we'll parse the second meaning of it in the second book, but stay with the High Lord in this case, we know that if Feyre were to admit that she loved him, it would change everything. And if she would stay with him, everything would be righted. So while yes, this quote changes later and becomes meaningful in a different way later, I really do think that at this particular point in the book, the double entendre is great, but I truly do think at this point it's about Tamlin. You haven't gotten to that point, so when we get to this, it's chapter like 50, 51, 52, somewhere in that area of book 2. You'll get this quote again and it will have different meaning.
Yeah.
And then, we were talking about page 176 where Tamlin was telling us his parents were mated. It's kind of worth noting that all of the mating bonds we hear about are, how do I say this without spoilers? We hear more about mating bonds later, and they're all there's a specific pattern to who we hear has these mating bonds. Like, our first mention for a mating bond is Tamlin's parents. He's a High Lord and he has a mate. And, we're going to continue to see a pattern in mating bonds and who has them throughout the books. And then also, I know I mentioned this earlier, but Lucian says that all other courts perform the Great Rite. And I want to keep a note of that because that's not really accurate. And we're going to hear more about it later down the road.
All right? Well, I mean, it makes sense because if every court did it at the same time, then they would be at their respective courts probably. And this Great Rite is made up of...
Well, the Great Rite, if he had said all the seasonal courts do it, it would have made sense. And I would have been like, oh, okay, so at each, point where that season needs to be strong or like is at its peak, that's when they do the Great Rite. But he says specifically that all other courts perform the Great Rite. But that rite seems very specific to the Spring Court. And, we'll see later how and if. Yeah, lots of fairy sex orgies. He definitely looks forward to that. So proud of you.
That's why I get up in the morning.
I've converted you. It makes me so happy.
Which we don't even get to see.
Yet.
I'm just saying.
I can't help but think of Ianthe when I hear the Great Rite. So, yeah, that's a nice reference other people will get. But you'll learn about that a little bit later. So... all right, I think that's it.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that wraps it up for this week. We'd love to know your thoughts on this week's chapters and content. Please drop us a comment. Respond to this week's poll. I post them on our Spotify show page. Send us a DM on Instagram or TikTok or wherever it is that you listen and you want to share your thoughts. Please, if you enjoy our show, tell your friends, share our show, or go to our social media and just share our posts, maybe comment on them. Every little bit helps. Real time. Thanksgiving is this week. If you're celebrating, we hope you have a wonderful holiday. Eat tons of food, get really sleepy, and have some great drinks, all that jazz. And we hope you tune in next week.
Yeah. See you next week.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, hit that like button, subscribe to the show, and share. You can connect with us on any of our social media accounts or leave us a comment. If there's anything you want to hear us talk about, reach out and let us know. We look forward to you tuning in next week.